Thank you so much, Dr. Jacobs. That was very informative. Thank you for sharing that. So as Reverend Ann mentioned in the beginning, if you have a question, please put your name into the chat and then I will call on you. And then you'll have 2 minutes to ask a question and then, or make a statement, however you'd like to share, and then we can go from there. So my eyes are to the chat.
Would anyone like to speak? Have a question for Dr. Jacobs?
All right, I see Stacia's name in the chat. That Ian's hand is raised. Great, okay. Why don't we will go in order. So let's start with Stacia, please. You can feel free to come off mute.
Hi. Thank you for a very good presentation and some very thoughtful research. It was lovely to see the things you presented from the New York State Archives. When I was looking at Stuyvesant's life and some things about New York slavery, I was really taken by what an administrative systems mind Stuyvesant had. And I was really surprised to learn that many of the systems we still use in New York are from Stuyvesant. And I'm wondering if you'd found in your research things that draw from his administrative genius. And it just seems such a contradiction to me that when I was reading these, that somebody could be also so brilliant in the humanitarian things that he set up to make the colony work, especially in downtown with like the fire brigade and the policing. And I think you're heading in a direction that's very interesting. And I'm wondering if there's anything in inference to draw from that in terms of what he may have thought about slavery and the economic welfare of the colony.
One of the things that is so problematic with the image of Stuyvesant is that he's assigned all kinds of things, such as being the founder of the fire brigade and of the police and all of that. What we need to, and I'm not going to give an entire lecture on that, although I probably could, the administrative system in New Netherlands was quite complicated. And it is probably better to compare, if you want a comparison to modern day government, to compare Stuyvesant with the New York State governor. The New York State governor would not be involved on a detailed level in the runnings of New York City. Similarly, Stuyvesant, as Director General of New Netherlands, would, after 1653, gradually leave more and more things to be done by the New Amsterdam city government. So while the New Amsterdam city government would need Stuyvesant's permission to start up some things, they would have a free hand in arranging it. So for the fire brigade and the policing, actually, Stuyvesant had relatively little to do with it. As to economic welfare, yes, in a general sense, he was involved. Arrangements for regulating the fur trade, for instance, for land grants, all of that was done by Director General and Council. Keep in mind that this is collective government. We may call Stuyvesant governor, but his powers were not comparable to those of governors of English colonies, which had a much more authoritarian system. Director General and Council were the ones taking decisions. It was not Stuyvesant personally. Stuyvesant could be outvoted in council, although that rarely happened, I have to say. So, in some ways, his role was far less important than it is made out to be. And looking at the exact way that the colony and New Amsterdam were run makes that clear to me, at least. The problem is, and I use that phrase deliberately, it is stripping away the myth from the man. And there is so much myth attached to Stuyvesant that it is very difficult sometimes to get a hold of who he actually was and what he was able to do. And I'm aware that that is only a partial answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian, did you have a question? Feel free to come off mute.
Okay, you were asking.
Hey, my name is Ian Knife. I'm a local artist, activist, originally born in Zimbabwe. So I've lived through apartheid. I've lived through colonialism. I've lived through the great men that they called great men. They put their name brand on everything, and their name brand lasts for a lifetime. Cecil Rhodes. I grew up in Zimbabwe. So when you try, we're never going to heal. I'm just saying, from an African black man point of view, we are never going to heal when we try to polish. I'm going to call it in slang, turd polishing. Trying to polish it until it becomes a diamond. We are never going to heal from this story of racism when we start by trying to sugarcoat and turn Peter Stuyvesant into a saint, into a hero, into a great, wonderful man. I grew up in a time where we used to play a song, Christopher Columbus was a great man. He sailed to America on a saucepan. It's what they taught us in Africa, right? And the traces and the behavior towards Africans by the Dutch doesn't just end at New Amsterdam. It went on all the way through Africa till today. So we as Black people have been God's gift to the Dutch. We have been your gift, the gift to the Dutch. Create your wealth for you. Create wealth for you from all corners of the world, because we were objects that were just placed on this planet for your picking. So let's not sugarcoat slavery. Please, I'm asking you, don't sugarcoat slavery. Tell the truth. It's the way we're going to move on. This conversation is polishing, it's about polishing Peter Stuyvesant's turd, right? We're not trying to solve the problem of the effects of his racism, the effects and side effects of that transatlantic slavery that has came into America, went all the way to Brazil. So you're not going to change the story. We appreciate your efforts and everything, but man, the story has been written. We know the story. It's our story that you are going to keep trying to polish every time. This city of New York City, right, it has the greatest population of Black people. How many statues do you find in Washington Square Park about any of those Black residents of New Amsterdam? How many parks are named after the Black residents of New Amsterdam? We still have a hanging tree in New York University, NYC. There's a hanging tree. We have all these kids are going to throw parties under the hanging tree. We have our ancestors buried in city parks where your kids go and smoke crack, play football on top of the graves of our ancestors. And all you do is just put a plaque on the side of the street, and then you hire these people who go around and try to make Peter Stuyvesant look like a hero. We're never going to heal. I'm just telling you the truth. I'm not here to fight you, but it's angering to just, for 400 fucking years, we keep getting the same polished story. We're never going to heal. This is a time for healing. It's universal. You can't control it. You can't control it. You will never control it. This is just happening by nature. It's happening all over the world. They want to dig up Cecil John Rhodes out of Bulawayo. They want him out of there. We want Peter Stuyvesant out of town. We want all of these heroes of white supremacy, the root of white supremacy, not the police department. It's not the police department is the slave patrol. They're playing a role that was created for a long time. And we are just playing along with it and dodging each other with sugar-coated stories about these men we know. Peter Stuyvesant's statue is not standing there because he was like a friend of Jesus Christ. He made money for the Netherlands. He made the Netherlands rich.
Thank you, Ian. Did you have a question?
Ian, it's okay if you don't. I thank you for sharing, and I'm grateful that you did.
I'd like to reiterate what Ann said in the beginning when she introduced this series. It is a series. We are just beginning. Today is the first day. It's like peeling back an onion. And it is not our intent to make a hero of anyone. We're trying to get to the bottom of it, exactly what Stuyvesant's role was in bringing slaves to New Amsterdam. That's part of our goal here. The other part is to educate. So, you know, if we have to move further than our first installment to have a full view of what it is that's before us. Thank you.
Would you like me to say something? I am sorry, Ian, if what I said has angered you. I am not interested in elevating Stuyvesant to any hero status. I don't believe in heroes. I would not care if his bust were removed from St. Mark's. That is not what it's about for me. I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything. And I'm sorry if it made that impression on you. Because I can feel your pain. Well, that sounds melodramatic, and I don't think melodrama is what we need. But what I am is a historian. I look at documents. I draw conclusions. And when I find that some of the things that have been said are not in accordance with what I can find in the original records, then that is what I have to report as a historian. I think history is quite complicated, and actually the past is not a nice place at all for very few people. And that especially, of course, refers to the Black people. So I do think that there is a case to answer in that respect. And I'm unconvinced that healing, which is the word that you used, is something that we can achieve quickly. And I agree with Liz that it needs a lot of talk. It needs a lot of understanding. My role as a historian is to tell a story based on documents. I write my articles, my books, with references to original documents, which I interpret. And I know there is a bias in my interpretation, in the records that are left, and in the stories that we tell. But as scholars, we all try to remove our own personalities as far as we can, with the limitations that there are, from these stories. And I'm very glad for your contribution in that respect, because I can see when I look at these stories and how people affiliate with some of the people involved, there is anger. I can feel, I myself feel angry sometimes when reading history, when reading things about homosexuals in the 17th century and the way that they were punished by people like Stuyvesant. So thank you for contributing to this conversation.
Jaap, with your blessing, we'd like to give questions and answers a little more time. Are you open to that?
I'm fine with that.
15 minutes, 20, half hour, what would you?
2 hours if you need it.
Okay. Let's see where we go. Okay.
Thank you. Rufus.
Yes, I'm sorry to sort of be putting my hand up so much. I have to leave shortly for a different event. Thank you so much, Professor Jacobs, for your presentation. I find as a white import to New York and with a past, with an English family past where I suspect the family got some of its money from sugar plantations in the Caribbean, although I don't know that. And having been here now in New York for 28 plus years, my old inclinations to want Stuyvesant to be found to be a better guy than we think he probably was is very strong. But my new sensibilities, well, relatively new, last 20 years, sensibilities around this, I did pick up a whiff of habilitation of Stuyvesant in your words. Not that I feel that you were being unfactual or unhistorical in any way at all. It's clearly you research everything very, very, very deeply. But I think the question I have for you is, are we trying to habilitate the man, or can we lay much more stress on what you said last, which I thought was really significant and moving, which is that Maaike should have her own statue in St. Mark's Churchyard, and that other formerly enslaved or enslaved people of New York of that era, that there should be more research to bring them into the open and to have proper memorials to them, so that we can accept Stuyvesant's linkage with our beloved church, but at the same time we can celebrate the celebrations made to this same community by enslaved peoples from the 17th century onwards. Do you think that, I mean, you asked the question, do you think that there's a possibility to do something consistent with fellow historians to bring African people to the fore when we're talking about the history of New York?
I would definitely hope so. I have to add that when I started with research on this paper, I didn't expect this to be the outcome. I was actually surprised and shocked myself when earlier this week, when I thought I don't, that we don't actually know how, when I discovered that the 40 slaves that are usually referred to was not correct. Now, I only found 2, as I mentioned, but I can't believe that that was all. I just don't believe it. So more research is required, and I do hope that with the help of other historians, and I've noticed a few in the audience, that we will be able to have our input. So I mentioned a few historians already. I mentioned Andrea Mosterman, whose name I saw. I mentioned Dennis Maaike, and Susanna Shaw-Romney, who's at NYU. I also see that Nicole Maskil is in the audience and has put in a request for a statement. And Morgan, if you could let Nicole speak, I would really think that is important. So I would hope that I'm inclined to say we, but I can't speak for myself. This is the problem of St. Mark's and its congregation. My suggestion at the end of my story to do something with Maaike is nothing more than that. And actually it goes in some ways already beyond my brief as a historian. As a historian, I am not resolving any issues from the past. That is not what I'm for. But if this suggestion would be something that St. Mark's picks up on and considers one of the many ways forward without excluding any other way, then I would find that very pleasing. Let me more bluntly put it like this. If there was a fundraiser now to create another Stuyvesant statue or to create one for Maaike, I know where I would put my money.
You mentioned Nicole, Dr. Jacobs, and you said that she's here. So Nicole, did you want to say something?
Hi, yes, thank you, everyone. This has been a really interesting and wonderful discussion. I've been also researching in this area for a while, and I've been interested in Peter Stuyvesant and his life and his connection to slavery. And I really wanted to talk about how sources can be, I think what Dr. Jaap says, how they can be so frustrating, surprising, especially in the original language, but also as a Black historian doing research in this, I think the pain of history is something that is always present, and I think I feel like one thing that might be healing, kind of that question of kind of healing, is thinking about what Dr. Jaap said in terms of bringing up the names of enslaved people, bringing their stories to the fore. I think part of what has been white supremacist about history has been it's always about, right, these people who we know, even if they only had one enslaved person, that person's life was kidnapped and stolen from them in the most brutal way. And so I wanted to acknowledge the pain. Also, I wanted to talk about doing history in New York and ways that we can make things more accessible for people kind of everywhere who are interested in this history. Myself doing history in New York as a Black person, I faced racism. I faced being racially profiled in stores, not picked up by, thrown out of cabs in the middle of rainstorms. And I think the connection between our lived experience today and the experience of the past is something that I think now we are really talking about because of this connection to the death of unarmed Black people across the world. And so I didn't really have a question. I just wanted to kind of affirm this conversation and think more broadly about how we make this history more accessible, and also just wanted to acknowledge the pain of what this history is very painful, even for historians. So
it is, Nicole. It definitely is. As indicated earlier by the Reverend Ann, there has been a plan to extend this conversation and perhaps have a monthly talk. And I have been asked also to put forward names, and yours is on my list for that. So I hope you would be able to talk to the congregation of St. Mark's about this and about your experience as a Black historian doing research on this topic. I think that would be a very valuable input.
Thank you. Someone put in the chat, Lincoln, they said, so how many slaves did Stuyvesant actually personally own in your view? You touched on this a little bit, but I just want to make sure we uplift that question.
I don't know. As I said, the figure 40, or at least the source on which that figure is based, is not correctly interpreted. The only document I found as yet is the 2 black boys that were part of the inventory of the Bowery. Just the, and talking about pain here, Nicole, to read something like that, a hayrick, 6 horses, a few cows, and 2 black boys. But at the moment, I really don't know, because it is so complicated. It's clear that Stuyvesant had involvement with Maaike. And that's just one, even though he did not actually own her. But I feel sure that there must be others. I cannot believe that Stuyvesant never had any slaves, but finding them and assigning all these, well, assigning is not the right word, but getting the correct a possible a picture as we can of who were slaveholders, who were the slaves, and what was their relation is vitally important in moving this discussion forward. We need to get as many facts as we can while acknowledging that the scarcity of sources, the bias of sources, makes some questions unanswerable. And I'll leave it at that. And this is ongoing research, and I can only hope that with other historians as well in the audience, that the caveat that I put in, that we really need to be very careful whose slaves these actually were. Were they West India Company? Were they Stuyvesant's? Were they Roosevelt's? I don't think so. I don't think the Roosevelts had any slaves at that point in time. Actually, not at this point in time, Nicole. Later on, right? Well,
Yes,
Nicole
later.
has
They
done,
were much poorer in this
yeah,
time period.
that's what I thought.
Yeah.
But slavery is also quite different, as you know, Nicole, in the 18th century, and that is where my expertise is far less than yours. So that is why it's so important to make those distinctions. And it may look like nuancing, and that sometimes can be interpreted in a way that isn't intended. Let me put it very carefully there. So I don't know how many slaves Stuyvesant had. I'm not willing to say he had only 2, because I don't think so. 40, well, possibly. 500, no. Impossible. 100 would be very exceptional. But I don't know. Not yet.
Thank you. I'm going in order of how folks put it in the chat. So next up is Jan. Do you have a question, Jan? You have 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jacobs. I was just very curious when you said that they did not want to sell slaves to Catholic countries. Was that because of religion, or were they treated worse by Catholic countries? I mean, that's the question.
The Dutch Republic found its origin in a revolt against Spanish overlordship. Calvinism was a very strong part of that. The whole reason, I think, why Stuyvesant joined the West India Company in the late 1620s, early 1630s in the first place, was to fight against Spain. In his own family and in the family of his wife, there had been several incidents that this is very clearly anti-Spanish. The Spanish were the Antichrist in their view. The occupation, the assault of the Dutch on Portuguese Brazil was part of this effort to take the fight against the Iberian enemy overseas in order to make them to deviate, as it were, their resources so that they could not fight the Dutch Republic as they had been. yeah, this is very much about religion.
Ernest, do you have a question?
Hello, hi. Well, when I was thinking of Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart, which is ultimately a book about colonialism and history, and who gets to write history. But my real question is, does it really matter whether Peter Stuyvesant had 2 slaves or 40 slaves? Because the real issue is he had slaves, right? Yep. Ultimately, I mean, we can get into details and we need to know the reality and the truth. We need to know that, but the truth is he owned slaves. And it's nice to know that the Dutch had a different system of slavery than the Brits did, and the Brits were probably a crueler system of slavery, but it's still slavery. It's still someone owning another human being, making another human being less than being a human being. And ultimately, does it really matter whether we reform Peter Stuyvesant or we want to call it, sugarcoating? But ultimately, let's address the issue of slavery, and that Peter Stuyvesant was a slaveholder. Okay, it doesn't matter if he had 1 or 500, he still owned slaves.
Which is exactly why I made that point. And why, in a way, I was glad to find that document that shows that Stuyvesant had at least 2 slaves. Because that is the point that is, and you're absolutely right, that is far more important in this respect. So, yeah. There are, I should add, of course, other systems of inequality at work in the 17th century. And when you look at indentured servitude on the English side and other forms of contract labor on the Dutch side, inequality is everywhere. So, and that is something that is of importance here. And yes, I would agree with that. But whether it actually matters is again up to St. Mark's to decide whether this is the clinching argument to say that action should be taken, and whatever action that might be.
The next question that someone put in the chat is, what is the difference between New Amsterdam and New Netherlands? Someone provided an answer in the chat, but I would love to hear from you as well.
New Amsterdam is the city at the tip of Manhattan, which was the capital of the larger area claimed by the Dutch from pretty much Delaware to the Connecticut. So it's like calling Boston, Massachusetts. It's not the same thing.
Perfect, thank you. Holly, are you here? Do you have your question?
Oh, Holly. Hi, Holly.
Hi, let me put my video on just a second. Yeah, I guess I can maybe start video. Okay, got it. I'm just up in my attic working this morning. Hi, I'm an American historian. Anyway, one of the things I've been really thinking so hard about in terms of the English records for this exact period is about the nature of ownership. And I've been looking at a lot of different records from Virginia and Massachusetts and Barbados for these exact decades. And I'm really interested in particular, sort of the fine-tuned nature of how ownership is claimed, how it's maintained, how it's legally authenticated. And it seems to me that so just to give a very fine point that relates to the exact document that you found about Stuyvesant, although I haven't seen it, the Stuyvesant document, obviously. John Winthrop, the one-time governor of Massachusetts Bay in the 1640s, claimed Native Americans as slaves in his will, or claimed to own them in his will and to deed them. But the court when they were actually going through, and there's the second stage, which is the actual listing of who he owned and what was legal, did not put them on there. In other words, the court seems to have said they do not belong to him. So they refused to include them in the inventory. But it sounds to me like what you found is actually inventory. So it means that there's this extra degree of legal recognition. And likewise, there's a delay in Barbados with that, but you start to, and I mean, it's really, I don't know. I mean, the earliest records we have from like 1635. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. What I'm really trying to get my head around is how important is this legal recognition, and what kinds of privileges does it give the master, give the person who claims them as own, to own them? What kind of privileges does it give him legally in terms of what we would now call sort of law enforcement mechanisms, or can wealth mechanisms? Can you borrow money against this this thing you own, this person you claim to own? I mean, I'm interested in those fine details, and I'm interested in how it's working in Dutch law as opposed to English as it's being negotiated in all these different sites.
Thank you, Jorge. That is a very interesting question. Well, it's complicated, and there is no clear slave code for New Netherlands this early on. So all we have to go on is jurisprudence, in which actually the status of people isn't always mentioned either. There are a few inventory, or there's at least one that I know of, in which an enslaved person is included, but I can't find any contest about it. So this is a very difficult question, and I'm not sure that actually comparison with slave regimes elsewhere is very helpful here. With other Dutch, within the Dutch Atlantic, I mean, because slavery in Brazil was quite different. Curaçao really only starts later, and the sources for as Linda Rupert's work is also shown, is for the early decades of Curaçao are very, very scarce. So Holly, I'm sure I would have to say I'll look that up. I'll keep that in mind. I'll get back to you on that. Okay, good.
Marie, did you have a question?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Marie.
Okay. I did a little research of my own, and I found out that we have someone who happens to be a slave who came to New York. He was a hairdresser. He was the first one who created charity for orphanages. And I found out that he was a Haitian, as myself. His name was Pierre Toussaint. Now they're going to canonize him as a saint because he was raised as a Catholic. My question is this: even though we have a slave who came to the United States, but he became an apprentice hairdresser, but he was the first to create a charity for orphanages. Orphanage for him, him and his wife had an orphanage, and he taken the poor Black slave children and made them a home or whatever. And my question is this: if we have someone who is Black, who is Catholic, and make him into a saint, why is it there's no statues or anything to commemorate this man who done a lot for a lot of people, that when he came from Haiti as a slave, and he does a lot for the slave children during the 18th and the 19th century. And I don't want to know, why would they have nothing done for him, no statues or nothing? Because I did a little research on my own about him, because I found out that he was buried at St. Patrick's Cathedral Old Cemetery at the Old Cathedral Church at the Lower East Side. but nothing has been done for him. All I know is they made him a venerable, but he's gonna be canonized as a saint. Now, maybe I'm thinking maybe because he's a saint because he was the first slave that does charity for children. But my question is this: why nothing in the New York City ever done anything to commemorate, like make a statue of him or make something happening? I don't understand that. I'm just saying it just something that just I don't know, that's probably off the topic, but I'm just saying this is what I did this research on my own, and this is what I find out. So you took your long time to figure it out.
Thank you, Marie. Do you have any thoughts, Dr. Jacobs?
My first question would be, when did this man live?
Marie, you're on mute.
Okay. He came to the United States in 1787. He was a slave himself and came to the United States. And he was a slave back home in Haiti. So this is what I've done this research on my own.
Okay.
And he was a Haitian, just like me. I'm a Haitian, so.
Okay.
Yeah. Born in 1766.
I think, Nicole, if you're still with us, could you address this?
Yes, I'm so glad you brought up Pierre Toussaint. He's someone that I'm really interested in.
Yeah.
My family has also had a lot of history in Haiti, and I definitely think it's time for his story and his wife too. And I think that that's another important point about the part of women, Black women in the story in the 17th century and in the 18th century.
Right.
And I do think he should have, both of them should have a statue and I think also this is also about when statues started to proliferate and why.
Right.
You know, so many of these statues are coming up around the time of, you know, increased segregation, and they're making a specific argument about history. And I think that every generation, you know, makes that argument, and, you know, in their commemoration. And this is our time to get, I mean, someone would just start a petition to let's get Pierre Toussaint's statue up.
Yeah, exactly.
I would definitely send it around.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so we're now 30 minutes over. I see one more question. I see a couple more questions in the chat, but I think let's answer this next one and then we'll see how we do with time. So the next one that was in the chat was the Dutch West India Company actually in the business of trading slaves as part of their ownership of slaves?
So, that is a good question. No, I don't think that actually slave ownership of the West India Company would count as wealth. Not for the West India Company, although the labor obviously represented a monetary value. If you look at the amounts paid for enslaved people, the letter by Jeremias van Rensselaer is one. There are others as well. It's considerable sums that would be well over a year's salary for most people. So owning an enslaved person definitely was a sign of wealth, but how much it contributed to the welfare of the colony as it's in itself is a different matter. It is obvious though, but that's a different question. If you look at the effects of the slave trade and slave labor on the wealth of Amsterdam, rather than New Amsterdam, there is a considerable impact there. But that is, I should add mostly the bulk of it is 18th century, I would think, although what is happening in Brazil does play a bit of a role. But so it's not a factor of wealth as much as a sign of wealth, I would think. Does that answer your question, Stasia?
Stacia, are you still with us? Okay.
Yes, yes. The reason I was asking is in some of the work I did to preliminarily look at some of the history here was it seemed to indicate in two of the sources that about every third house in Manhattan had 1 to 2 slaves. Those were the two sources I found, and discussions with with a historian at St. Mark's said one of those sources, the data is widely used but often has holes in it. So interpreting it is not so easy. But the picture that I kind of came to from what I read was that about 1 in every 3 houses in Manhattan had 1 to 2 slaves, and that owning those slaves was much more important than real estate. And real estate had very quickly become an important ownership thing that we trace our roots in location actually back to the 1650s in New Amsterdam.
Mm-hmm.
So I likened this to, if we were walking on our way to church, every time we passed the Duane Reade or a Starbucks, that would be a house that had slaves. And so my question is really how does that ownership really, how is that in the economics of what happened here? My understanding is that it was vital, that was the whole thing, was to, if you had ownership of other people, it was a sign of your success in this culture and community. And that is a huge difference in how I think we look at this issue, and how we as a congregation want to engage with this material, and maybe be the place of starting to change the conversation in our community. Is
Mm.
it ubiquitous? Is it 1 in every 3 households? Is it what everybody needed to do, or is it, more the lucky few?
It depends on which time you're talking about. So this statistic that you are quoting, which year is that? That's a historian's question, of course, because if it's late 18th century, it is very different from the 1650s. And we in our company here together, there are other historians, more than I had expected actually, who are far better placed to answer that question if it pertains to the 18th century. So perhaps could we move that question to another session in time?
Of course, sure. I'd be more than happy to have other smart minds look at the sources and give some different interpretation, and maybe draw a different picture for us.
I need to emphasize there that I am very sure that for the 18th century, things look very different. And there is, like I said, there are specialists on the 18th century, on both upstate New York, but also on the city. And I'm thinking of Jill Lepore, for instance, and Joyce Goodfriend, who have studied the 18th century much more than I have. I'm limited. I'm a one-trick pony in many ways.
Thank you. All right, friends, if anyone has one more question, we have time for one more. You've been so gracious with your time, Dr. Jacob, so thank you for letting us go over a bit. Does anybody else have one last question? Or was there anyone that I missed that had a question in the chat that I missed? Apologies if I did. I was trying to scroll as best I could.
I'll jump in here. I would just love, for those of you who've stayed on with us, thank you. And for those of you who are historians, or for those of you who've gathered for this lecture, if there are topics that you think we should cover in this upcoming series, will you please type that into the chat so that we can take that into consideration as we're thinking through the rest of the year? We're thinking that probably once a month is the right pace to be able to wrap our minds and our hearts around all this information. And we would love to continue to ask these questions from a variety of perspectives. And so your thoughts and your willingness to be a part, if you're willing and you're interested in being a part of this, please put that as well. That will be a record that lives on beyond us. And then we'll loop back with you at that time. Jaap, any final words? Thank you. Thank you so much for your, both for your knowledge and your expertise, your graciousness, and your willingness to hold all of the feelings that are associated and felt deeply on these topics as we seek to make meaning and to know the fullness of the truth. I think that's not to erase anything away. I think we want to embrace that and then see where God leads us. So, yeah, anything?
Thank you very much, Reverend Anne. It's been a pleasure and, well, an honor to be able to kick off this conversation at St. Mark's.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm hoping, Jaap, that you're going to be a part of these series going forward, and we'll loop in afterwards. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're deeply grateful, and we can't really applaud you, Dr. Jaap, but please, we do for your presence among us, and thank you. Blessings.
And thank you, Morgan.
Yes, Morgan. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.